This sermon comes from a talk I gave at camp a few weeks back. And the talk was about how to grow after camp had ended. We talked about a few weeks back when discussing the transfiguration about coming down from like a spiritual high. And camp has that really bad. If you've ever been to a camp, or you might be even familiar with this without, typically near the end of the camp week and then as you leave, you have a very strong and firm desire to grow. And you have a fervent desire to eradicate sin in your life and to just overall be more spiritually minded. And the reason I bring this up is because I don't think this is limited to camps. I think we have this after gospel meetings, after very encouraging Sundays, after just get-togethers that we find encouraging. And what I want to do is talk about that concept of growth tonight and how we grow. But not just how we grow, but in what way do we grow and what is working when we grow. And I also want to take a second later to discuss the enemy of growth that is very prevalent, I believe, and can very easily sneak into our lives, and how Jesus dealt with both. But first, if you would, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. That's where we're going to spend the first few minutes of our sermon this evening. 1 Corinthians 3. I want to start out tonight by laying that kind of foundational idea of growth and how growth works and what is working when we grow. So we're going to start in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We're going to jump right into the text. And we're going to start in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 3. And I, brethren, could not speak to you as to spiritual men, but as to men of the flesh, as to infants in Christ. I gave you milk to drink, not solid food, for you are not yet able to receive it. Indeed, even now you're not yet able, for you are still fleshly. For since there is still jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly? Are you not walking like mere men? Paul's saying here, he's like, I should be able to talk to you guys like Christians who are maturing. But you're not. I can't talk to you like that. You wouldn't understand. The church in Corinth is filled with division and strife and jealousy. And it's because they're not growing. Even after knowing the Lord for a little while now, they are still fleshly. I think this is a little bit relatable to us. We can spend years, can't we, as professing Christians, and yet in many senses still feel or be fleshly, feel divisive, filled with strife and jealousy as the Corinthians were. But then Paul goes on in verse 4 to explain why they're divided when he says, for when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not mere men? The Corinthians are dividing themselves into camps based on who taught them. And that seems like a really juvenile thing to do, doesn't it? But I see it in me a lot. Maybe not so much in the divisive sense, like with the Corinthians, but in the sense of holding me back from growth. And perhaps you might too. Let me explain. If we put the majority of our spiritual encouragement on the hinge of being around a few spiritual friends and mentors, so that we can't function or mature unless they're with us at all times, we seem to overlook what Paul says in these next verses. Verse 5, what then is Apollos? And what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave opportunity to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So that neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his labor. Each will receive his award according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Apollos could not cause growth. Not even the Apostle Paul, great as he was, could cause growth. Only God could. Now, were Apollos and Paul necessary for the Corinthian church to grow? Absolutely. They had to plant and water the seed of truth. They were vital in the growth process, but they did not cause the growth. God did. Likewise, in our lives, are our brothers and sisters necessary for the process of growth that takes place within our lives? Definitely. And can we, in our lives, participate in helping others to grow? Absolutely. But can our brothers and sisters cause growth within us? Can we, in speaking to those about Christ and admonishing our brothers and sisters, in teaching, cause or create or force growth in our brothers and sisters? No. Paul makes it clear that position is not for us to fill. That is God's part in the process. But what's the temptation for us? I have a relationship with God, so I don't really need brothers and sisters. I read my Bible, I pray. To be honest, my brothers and sisters are more annoying than anything. I'm really self-sufficient spiritually. I'm kind of a spiritual oasis. I'm independent. I'm self-sustaining. Maybe you don't struggle with that frame of mind. Maybe you think more like this. I just don't feel like I can grow unless I'm around a couple of other particular people that really push me, that really make me do better. Otherwise, I'm just kind of lukewarm. I just go through the motions. But there's an issue with these mentalities. You see, both focus on communing, that idea of sharing spiritually, but either with fellow Christians or with God. Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 3 a process where one must do both, commune with man through the watering and planting of the seed, but also commune with God through growth. Through communing with man, through the encouragement and the teaching and the relationships that are formed, but also with God through prayer and through his word and through meditation of it, causing growth. So then, growth is not caused solely by relationship with God or with brothers and sisters, but by communing with both God and with our brothers and sisters. So now, we got that foundation laid. I want to go now and turn, if you would, to Matthew chapter 16. That's where we're going to spend the rest of our time this evening. I want to look at how Jesus handled this, because Jesus is going to address and act out this idea of communing, but he's also going to address the enemy of growth. See, we can do a lot of things right, can't we? We can read our Bibles, we can come to church 3 times a week, we can pray. But if we have the wrong focus, we won't yield the proper fruit for God, that which he would have us to yield. And so I want to do something kind of irregular. Jesus is going to call out in Matthew chapter 16 in verse 5 and 6, what is the enemy of growth? And I want to start there. But then I want to move backwards in the text and look at the Pharisees acting out this enemy of growth, and then look at the end of chapter 15 to where Jesus is the perfect example of one who communes. Let's read in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 5. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they began to discuss this among themselves, saying, "He said that because we did not bring any bread." But Jesus, aware of this, said, "You men of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves that you have no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets full you picked up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets full you picked up? How is it then that you do not understand that I do not speak to you concerning bread, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees?" Then he understood that he did not say beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. This is right after Jesus has dealt with the Pharisees and Sadducees and had a confrontation with them after feeding the 4,000, which we're going to get to both of those in a second. Jesus says something kind of odd here that we would read and think that's kind of odd. He says, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." That's not a phrase we use very often. But as odd as it sounds to us, I think it would sound odder to the disciples. The Pharisees and Sadducees had a lot of laws and traditions, as we've talked about in the past, that were not rooted in the Mosaic law. Some of these included those within their religious sects could not buy bread from Gentiles or Samaritans, those who were not Jews. And so from Pharisees and Sadducees, you would often hear things like, "Watch out and beware of the bread of the Gentiles and Samaritans." But Jesus isn't saying that. Jesus is saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Why does Jesus care about bread so much? Well, fun fact about bread, if you don't know as much about bread as me, and I know very, very little, leaven is something you put in bread to make it swell, right? It inflates the bread. And the text makes a connection in verse 12 of how the leaven is actually the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Remember how we talked about last time, in my last sermon, about how the Pharisees and Sadducees had a very work-centered approach towards religion. They thought that their actions basically made themselves righteous. They justified themselves by their obedience. They earned their righteousness. It was not a gift. How would these teachings affect them? It would make them prideful, right? It would swell them up. It would inflate them, just like leaven does to bread. It made them, keyword, self-righteous. And that, I believe, is the enemy of growth, self-righteousness. Paul speaks of this in regards to the Jews in Romans 10:3. We're not going to turn there. But he says concerning the Jews, for not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. The Pharisees and Sadducees would reject God's righteousness, which would take the form of Jesus, and seek to establish their own instead. And we see them do this at the beginning of chapter 16. So let's look and see the self-righteousness of the Pharisees in action. Matthew 16 and verse 1. The Pharisees and Sadducees came up, and testing Jesus, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied to them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you not know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given to it, except the sign of Jonah. And he left them and went away. The Pharisees and Sadducees come up to Jesus, and they ask for a sign. But let's be clear. Do the Pharisees and Sadducees really want to see a sign from Jesus? No. They're just out to try and prove that he's not the Messiah. They've already proven that even seeing signs does nothing to change their hardened hearts. They just attribute that to Satan. And so, rightfully so, Jesus calls them evil and adulterous for this. It makes sense that Jesus would call them evil, right? I mean, they're trying to basically overthrow Jesus. But why are they adulterous? That's a weird phrase to use, isn't it? They seek to establish their own righteousness, their own self-righteousness. They do not want the righteousness of their God, which they are in covenant with. They want to get righteousness outside of that covenant. And so therefore, they commit spiritual adultery. The self-righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees leads to their own spiritual adultery. And that sounds scary, doesn't it? And that's not anything we can fall into, is it? Have you ever heard someone say something like this, or maybe you yourself have said it, because I have, where I'm trying to grow more, but I'm reading my Bible, and I'm praying more, and I'm spending time with more spiritually like-minded friends. I just don't seem to be growing much. And if I could just become more spiritually self-sustaining, more spiritually independent, I wouldn't need these others to improve. I'd grow all the time. But in doing so, I abandon the righteousness of God. I leave his plan for growth, trying to get to where I plant, and I water, and I cause the growth all in myself. And I become like that evil and adulterous generation, where I'm wanting a sign to come about, but I'm wanting to see it for the wrong reasons. I decide that I'm going to commune with myself, not with fellow Christians, not with God. I want to go on a tangent for a second. I think this subject applies really well towards evangelism. It's something that has our theme this year. What about not just personal growth, but the growth of those around us, whether that be fellow Christians or those who are out in the world? Sometimes we get into the mentality, this is something I battle, where you think, if I just make them read enough scriptures, if I debate efficiently enough, if I make just the right points, expose enough of their hypocritical and ridiculous arguments, if I just push and pry hard enough, then they'll see the truth because of what I did. And they'll be baptized, and they'll be so grateful to me. But that's a really slippery slope, isn't it? Because then that leads to, they'll be grateful to me because I practically saved them. I mean, I'm the one responsible, right? But we're not on a conquest to reveal our own righteousness, the righteousness of ourselves to the world, but the righteousness of God. I struggle with this mentality because, I don't know, I find this fact of how God works with us in evangelism is actually such a blessing the more I look at it. Think about the growth process and planting a seed. Is it difficult to plant a seed? In literal terms, it's pretty easy. You put a seed in the ground and you cover it up. And in spiritual terms, it takes courage. But often it shocks us as to how little it takes to plant the seed of truth in someone, and just the little thoughts that it is. What about watering? Watering is a responsibility that can be shared by a lot of people in the church. And oftentimes it's little bits of teaching and little examples that water the seed over time. But what about causing growth? Because I'm going to be honest, I don't know where to start. What would I do to cause growth in someone? What do I need to do? How am I going to know if I do the first two steps of planting and watering good enough that the third step is going to be growth? But that's why God causes growth and not us. God helps us and does the hardest part of the job. And this is such a comfort to me. Because me thinking back on as people that I have spoken to about the gospel, and I encourage you to do the same, it's really hard for me not to feel like when there have been people that I have been sure that they are going to come to the knowledge of the truth, that they're going to see the light, and then they don't, and they walk away and they show their true colors, that I think for days and weeks and months after, if I had just said this instead, if I had done A, B, and C differently, then they'd be here right now. But just because a triad evangelism doesn't end in baptism does not mean that we have failed. Because our job is to plant and water seeds. And if we've done that, if we have invited people to commune with us in the truth, then we have succeeded. We've done our part. Whether they choose to commune with God and to let Him cause the growth in them, that is up to them. And that's such a burden off my shoulders. Because I don't have to worry about doing the job right. I do have to worry about doing the job right. Please understand. The quality of the job that I do, the substance of what I do matters. But God takes the meager job that I do in evangelism, and He somehow uses that for growth in others. We've talked about what not to do from the Pharisees. But what can we learn to do from Jesus? Let's back up one last time. The last passage we're going to read tonight, Matthew 15, starting in verse 29. Departing from there, Jesus went up by the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up on the mountain, He was sitting there. And large crowds came to Him, bringing with Him those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others. And they laid them down at His feet, and He healed them. So the crowd marveled as they saw the mute speaking, and the crippled restored, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. And Jesus called His disciples to Him and said, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. The disciples said to Him, Where will we get so many loaves in this desolate place to satisfy such a large crowd? And Jesus said to them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few small fish. And He directed the people to sit down on the ground. And He took the 7 loaves and the fish, and giving thanks, He broke them and started giving them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 7 large baskets full. And those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, Jesus got into the boat and came into the region of Magdala. Jesus has multitudes of people coming to Him. And Jesus heals them. Unlike the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who would turn away one who is so unworthy, so unclean, Jesus welcomes them and helps them. Jesus does not simply see a need to commune with God to remain separate and therefore remain separate from the people, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees do. Rather, he wants to share and give to his Jewish brethren. I think we could all agree that out of anyone that has ever lived, Jesus needs the least to be with those who are his brothers and sisters. Because we need encouragement because we're weak. Jesus is the best of us, though. And yet Jesus still makes time to help those who he can, where he is. And because of this communing which he has, in verse 32, Jesus feels compassion on the people. And instead of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Jesus uses what his disciples have with them and uses that to give to the people. He gives bread not of self-righteousness, but out of the righteousness of God. Bread given out of love, out of humility. And what is the result when Christ shows such grace as this? The end of verse 31 says, "And they glorified the God of Israel." When we focus on looking outward, communing with our brethren and God, we will have an opportunity the world will have an opportunity not only to see the kingdom of heaven at work and see the blessing of being in it, but they will also see to turn their attention towards God. And they will have the opportunity to glorify him and the chance to commune with him as well. Tonight, there may be someone here who's had the seed planted in them, and it has been watered. And in doing so, you have communed with God's people. God now calls you, as he calls all of us, to commune with him. And let him cause growth in you as he causes it in all of us.